Tempo changes are often overlooked in a lot of mainstream music. If ever they happen at all, it's usually just a simple ramp up or down, or something like halftime or double time. But if you have some proggy tendencies like I do, then sometimes different sections of the song call for different tempos, so you'll probably want to make the transition between those tempos as seamless as possible. It's pretty easy to just automate tempo willy nilly with no relationship between the two tempos. But if you want to play live or with musicians, then you'll find you'll make your life a lot easier if you make the tempos have some sort of rhythmic relationship to each other. This is where metric modulations come in. So if you know how to change keys, that would be like a harmonic modulation. The way that you usually do that is by using a chord that is common to both keys and using it as a pivot point to launch yourself into the new key and cover up that transition. So it's kind of the same thing with rhythm. So before we go further, you kind of need to know the difference between a rhythmic duration and a rhythmic value. So a rhythmic value is basically just a rhythm that is relative to a tempo. A quarter note doesn't mean anything in terms of how long it's supposed to last unless we have a BPM with it. So a quarter note at 60 is 1 second, but a quarter note at 120 is half a second. A rhythmic duration is an absolute value, meaning it's just a length of time. So, like the rhythmic duration of a quarter note at 60 is 1 second. That's an absolute value. So, 1 second is the rhythmic duration. The simplest way to do a metric modulation is to take a rhythmic value in the first tempo and make it equivalent in duration to a rhythmic value in the second tempo. So example, rhythmic value in tempo 1 is a dotted quarter note that becomes the quarter note of the new tempo. It doesn't have to equal the new quarter note of the new tempo. It all depends on what the pulse is of your next section and what is the most simple. But if we're talking about 4/4 going from X rhythmic value to a quarter note is the easiest one because the quarter note is the pulse of 4/4. Unfortunately, there's a bit of math to do, but luckily, as someone who hasn't really done math since like high school, I can assure you that it's not that hard. The formula for metric modulations is old rhythmic value divided by new rhythmic value equals old tempo divided by new tempo. So for the rest of this video, we're going to go through some examples of different types of modulations that are relatively common in most like groove-based music. And then at the end, we'll kind of troubleshoot a real world example to make it a little bit more seamless than these examples, which are pretty crude just for a demonstration's sake. So the first example is going to be a dotted eighth note. The original tempo is 108 BPM. So let's listen to the original section so we can get it into our heads, and then I'll show you the formula and how it sounds when we do the metric modulation. How we plug it into the formula. So a dotted eighth note is what fraction of a quarter note. So we know that it's 3/4 the length of a quarter note. So that means that we do, on one side of the equation, we have 0.75 over 1. And then on the other side, we have 108, which is the old tempo, over X, which is what we don't know. So when you plug in the math, we end up with 0.75x equals 108. So now what we have to do is divide 108 by 0.75, and now we're going to be at 144 BPM. So this is what it would sound like if we do that tempo change, but with no setup. Pretty jarring transition because there is no transition. Most of the time when you're setting up a rhythmic modulation, you're going to have one person, sometimes everyone, play the rhythmic value in the old tempo as a setup to the new tempo. Basically, this person is kind of doing a count off to the next tempo, but with what they're playing. So, for example, in this case, the bass and piano will be playing the rhythm that becomes the new quarter note. So they'll be playing the dotted eighth note. And best practice for this is to have them play that rhythm at least like a bar's length time of the new tempo as a setup so that everyone has a chance to hear it. The amount of time that it takes for the pattern to go from like a full bar is 3 beats. So 3 beats worth of dotted eighth notes. So that's why the pattern starts 3 beats before the new tempo, which admittedly is a bit quick. At least that way you have a full bar as a setup, if you want to call it that way. So the next example we're going to do is a quarter note triplet that becomes the quarter note of the next tempo. So in this case, on the left side, the old rhythmic value over new rhythmic value, we have 0.66, which is obviously a rounded number, but it's close enough. So 0.66 over 1 equals 108 over x. So 108 divided by 0.66. Now we get the tempo of 160. So in this case, I just did quarter note triplets for the entire bar before the setup, so the third bar of the pattern. In all these examples so far, it's still a bit jarring because it kind of sounds silly to just play the same thing in a faster tempo, but I'll show you later what it sounds like when your setup is a bit more polished and a bit sneakier, I guess. In bar 4, you can start tapping the triplets, and then if you continue tapping triplets, you'll notice that that triplet is now the new quarter note. So now we're going to do some examples that are slower. Half notes becomes the new quarter notes. So essentially we're doing half time. The math is simple. It's just 2 over 1 equals 108 over x. So now we divide 108 by 2. So we have 54. So now we have 2 bars worth of half notes as a setup to bar 4. To be honest, if it's just halftime, you don't really need a setup for that because everybody can just figure that out without having to do any math or to think about it really. So the next one we're going to do, another slow one, is dotted quarter note. So a dotted quarter note is 1.5 times the duration of a quarter note. So that means that our formula is going to look like 1.5 over 1 equals 108 over x. So that means 1.5x equals 108. So we do 108 divided by 1.5, which gives us the tempo of 72. So here, the pattern starts 6 beats before the change happens, because that way we get 4 dotted quarter notes before the change happens, which is going to feel like a bar. So listen to the piano and bass in bar on beat 3 of bar 3. That's when the pattern starts. If you want to give like a bar's worth of setup beforehand, it doesn't line up with the bars anymore, which means that you kind of have to be more careful with what notes and chords you give people because they come at weird parts in the bar. So in this case, for the bass, the note that crossed the bar line, I chose a common tone between both chords. And in the piano, I chose to anticipate the chord of the next bar since it's only an eighth note early, which is pretty common. but I still find that it sounds weak. So I'm starting from bar 3 right now. Now we're gonna kind of troubleshoot this one, try to make it work better within the context of this passage. So I don't particularly like this approach. So in this case, I got both the bass and the piano to do the same anticipation so that the harmonic rhythm happens at the same time. The harmonic progression becomes more clear because we don't have inversions in the bass. So this is a little bit better, but it's still not quite to my liking. And part of that is because it's not really musical yet. Option C is implicate the drums a bit more, which is probably, if there's going to be one person doing the metric modulation setup, it's usually going to be the drummer. So here we have a different kick pattern that emphasizes the dotted quarter note. It's not the greatest. Let's try using more of the drums. This one's a bit weird to me. If I play it without the click, then it's as if the tempo change starts like in the middle of bar 3 because the drums just start playing a backbeat pattern of the new tempo. So here's the same thing, but without the click. So this is not working for me because, like I said, the tempo change sounds like it's happening earlier, which is not really where it's meant to be felt, where the tempo changes. So the next thing I tried is the same thing, but with a different harmonic rhythm. So in this case, instead of the chord changing from G7 to C, whereas G7 is all of bar 3, and then bar 4 is the C, instead, I moved the C to start where our pattern starts, which is the middle of bar 3, which is like a bar of the new tempo equivalently. So here's the same thing with a different harmonic rhythm. So this is even more jarring because now it sounds like we have 2 bars of 4/4, a 2/4, and then a different tempo. So it doesn't really feel like we have that setup because, again, the drum is playing the backbeat thing there and the harmonic rhythm is different, making it feel like the meter is different. So here's the last example where we're trying to stay as close as possible to the original harmonic rhythm of 1 chord per bar. And then we're going to try to make the drums a bit more realistic where they're playing the old tempo and the new tempo at the same time, but it just sounds like a fill where they're kind of doing a polyrhythm as a setup to the next section. That's going to make the tempo feel like it happens at bar 5 where we want it to happen. The kick and crash are going to be doing the dotted quarter notes. Snares are going to be doing setups to those hits. But then the hi-hats, instead of changing to the new tempo, they're still in the old tempo. So we have at least one thing that is still doing the old tempo. So this is why it feels more like a fill and a polyrhythm that's setting up the next section. But then it turns out that when we get to the next bar, the tempo actually changed. So we'll play it one more time. You can see that the bass, piano, and the kick are doing the dotted quarter notes, and then the hi-hat is still keeping the time of the old tempo. So all of these examples have been pretty common metric modulations as far as mainstream-ish music go, but you'll notice like that like anything, not all of them are appropriate to the context. I find that the faster ones sounded kind of silly and the slow ones could work depending, but in the actual song that this is from, I didn't use any metric modulations because it didn't feel like that song needed it. And especially the fact that I'm doing this metric modulation in the middle of a phrase, that's really uncommon. Usually it's at the start of a new section. My word of advice is this usually works the best when you're transitioning to a new and different section and when used sparingly. And also works better when the rhythm that you're using as your transition is a rhythm that we've already heard in the song before. So in this case, most of the vocabulary is pretty much quarter notes and eighth notes and like basic rhythms like that. So there's no dotted quarter notes or like dotted eighth notes that really appear in this song. But if they did, you could set up that pattern where it just feels like you're doing an interesting rhythm every now and then. But then at some point, you use that rhythm as a setup to transition to a new tempo. And that way, it doesn't sound jarring where that kind of rhythmic vocabulary just comes out of nowhere. And now your metric modulation is going to be a lot smoother.